Good afternoon. It's September 25th, 2020, and this is episode 25 of Rob Explains, your daily podcast discussing and explaining cool, random, and interesting things. I'm Rob. Thanks for joining me. Inspired by Ethan B's episode idea from yesterday, I think for the next few episodes, what we're going to do is to cover some really famous but possibly really wrong American myths and legends. I'll try to touch on some things that you think you know for sure from American history and that you're probably completely wrong about. I guess the plan for the next few days and weeks will be to intersperse some American mysteries and history with some of our typical science and trivia episodes until we get to October. And then, oh boy, October gets to be fun. I have some things on the docket for the month of October, like some source of scary stories, some of our favorite holiday movies and where they come from, and more leading up to Halloween week, where we'll talk about our 7 scariest moments of history, or at least the ones I think that are scariest. But for today, let's start with possibly the legend that is as old as America itself. George Washington is the founder of our country. He's the first president, the only man to be unanimously selected by the Electoral College for the presidency. Washington may also be unique in the fact that there are so many legends about him personally and about his life. I wanted to touch on a few of them that you may have heard and you may know as fact, but just simply isn't a fact. One of the longest held myths about George Washington is that he had wooden teeth. Now, right at the start here, I'm going to tell you it's not true. Much like many aristocrats during this period, he did have dentures, but wood was never used to construct any full or partial set of dentures used by George Washington. They may have been made of varied materials, including horse teeth, cow teeth, ivory, possibly elephant or rhinoceros, a lead tin alloy, especially for the frames, a copper alloy, most likely something like brass, and a silver alloy. Now, many of these would have actually aged over time, and they would have taken on a brown appearance. Unlike natural teeth, which may look yellow with some aging and staining, many of these fake teeth would look brown, especially those made of metal and a metal alloy. And if any of the metal from the framing leached onto the teeth themselves, they might actually look like wood. And that's likely where this rumor came from. Perhaps one of the darkest parts of this legend is that no, he didn't have wooden teeth, but it's possible that he used human teeth in his sets of dentures. Speaking of Washington as an older man, it is also a popularized rumor that he, like many people of the day, used a white wig, or a wig that was powdered, to cover his own thinning hair. Now, while it is true that he did powder his hair to give it that really bright white appearance for portraiture and paintings, it actually was his own legitimate hair. And in every image that you've seen of Washington, generally you'll see it cut closer on the sides, longer in the back, and kept in a ponytail. And that's his actual hair. One fun fact, a young Washington, during his French and Indian War days, was actually a redhead. There is, of course, also the myth, the legend, that George Washington was the first president to live in the White House. Unfortunately, George never got to take up that residence. He became president in 1789. As I said, he holds the record as the only president to be unanimously elected by the Electoral College. During his presidency, he made plans for a new national capital, moving the capital from first New York, then Philadelphia, but finding a place to locate it. And he did so on the banks of the Potomac River in land shared by what was once Maryland and Virginia. This new place would later be named Washington in his honor, and the District of Columbia after Christopher Columbus. And while he laid the cornerstone for the new Capitol building and likely helped in the planning of the White House, he never actually got to reside in the home himself. The first president to live in the White House was John Adams, his successor. And he didn't live in the White House for his entire presidency, only the second part of it. Thomas Jefferson would have the honor of being the first president inaugurated and then moving directly into the White House. A side note, George Washington actually used the home of Samuel Osgood, a patriot from New York, as the presidential residence during his first term in office while the capital was in New York. That residence was actually located in what was known as Uptown at that point, facing the East River, and it was mere blocks from the pure, unadulterated countryside that we now know as Midtown Manhattan. Now let's turn to a couple of legends from early in Washington's life. Possibly the most famous legend surrounding Washington is the fact that when he was 6 years old, his father gave him a hatchet. He promptly went outside and attempted to cut down a cherry tree. When accused by his father of doing so, he said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my hatchet." Except that never happened. While I'm sure we wish our political leaders were beyond question and untraceably honest, George Washington was a man like any other, although he was certainly venerated in the first years of the 19th century. So where did that story come from? Well, it turns out that one of Washington's early biographers, Mason Locke Weems, came up with that story out of whole cloth. He wanted to show the remarkable virtues of Washington the man, who he had known personally and knew to be a very honest man. And to do so, he used the example of a young George Washington admitting to cutting down a cherry tree. But the story had never been heard before that. It was never spoken by Washington, and it's become a legend only through that biography. And not only was Washington a man of remarkable moral strength, but physical strength as well. You have, of course, heard the story that George Washington once flung a silver dollar across the Potomac River from his home at Mount Vernon. Or maybe you've heard that he actually skipped it across the entire river at that point. Well, I'm sorry, that is also a myth. In fact, the Potomac River at his home is over a mile wide. It would be nearly impossible for any person to launch a silver dollar that length, let alone skip it across the water. Even at its more narrow portions, the Potomac is insurmountably wide, and unless he went all the way up to the source of the river, it's unlikely he ever threw anything across it. Moreover, silver dollars were not minted until 1794. So unless a George Washington in his later years was able to perform this feat, well, it just didn't occur. Now, this story may have come out of a story that was told by his step-grandson, a man named George Washington Parke Custis. What this story is that early in his life, George Washington actually flung a piece of slate across the Rappahannock River in or around Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now, while this would still be a feat of strength, the Rappahannock River in Fredericksburg is much narrower, and a small chunk of slate is far lighter and more likely to fly further. But we like to think of our leaders as men of moral and physical strength, and the silver dollar story certainly puts that idea in our heads about George Washington. Now, how about the story of how George Washington was well known for his many victories on the battlefield? That's why he became president, after all. Well, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but unfortunately, General Washington wasn't a great military strategist. While he was someone who had high ranking in the British military before leaving to join the Patriots, and he had extensive experience as a soldier all throughout his early life, he actually lost far more battles than he won during the American War for Independence. In fact, of 12 major battles, he lost 9, winning only 3. But those 3 were very important battles, including the Battle of Trenton, where he caught Hessian soldiers by surprise on Christmas Day, and the Battle of Yorktown. Now, both of these weren't strategic battlefield victories, but they were what you might think of as signal victories. In fact, Yorktown was the major battle once the message reached the French in Paris that brought them on the side of the Americans and helped us leverage a surrender in the American War for Independence. However, he also surrendered major American cities like New York and Philadelphia, some of them more than once. And he allowed nearly the entire country to be gripped in the stranglehold of a blockade. Not a great military general. But in the end, perhaps his greatest show of leadership as a military professional was giving up his commission in the military before taking on the mantle of president, forever cementing the idea in the American lexicon that the civil authority of the president should never be mixed with the military authority of a general. Now, one final myth and legend from George Washington's life. You may have heard that George Washington is actually buried in a crypt below the U.S. Capitol. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, that's actually not true. Depending on where you live and where you grew up, you may have known this to be untrue. I know many people have made one journey to Washington, D.C. in their entire life, and it's possibly something they heard during that trip. However, having grown up in Maryland, I can tell you I made many trips to D.C., actually pretty regularly, just for no reason at all. And maybe it's from that background that I already know, and I can tell you, that Washington is buried at his estate of Mount Vernon, as he asked in his will. He's buried with his wife and many members of the Washington family. So where did the rumor start that he was buried in a crypt below the Capitol? Well, there actually was a crypt placed below the Capitol, and it was intended to be the home of the body of the first president. In fact, upon his death, many people tried to have him buried many places, the most substantial of which was below the Capitol. But if you can't tell from all of these myths and legends, George Washington was a simple man. He didn't look for veneration, and he didn't look for worship. And I'm sure he was worried that being buried at the center of government might lead to both of those things. So instead, he took a simple burial plot on Mount Vernon with the rest of his family, overlooking a beautiful portion of the Potomac. And you can still visit Washington's burial site today. Mount Vernon is a museum open to the public. Actually, it may be more open than the U.S. Capitol at this point. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Rob Explains. Look for new episodes daily wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. Do you have a subject you'd like me to cover, or just looking for more Rob Explains? Find us online on all social media at Rob Explains. Got a comment, question, or query? Or did I get something wrong and you want to correct me? Shoot me an email, rob@robexplains.com, or you can leave a comment down below. I'll check those right after the show goes live. And you can send me a message, anchor.fm/RobExplains/message. And in the form of a voicemail, I can actually include it in a future episode. Once again, thank you for joining me. Until next time, this is Rob. Take care of yourselves and each other. Have a great day.